Today we're going to be learning about the writing process and writing your own narrative. First, we'll be talking about the writing process. This is where you start to think of yourself as an author. You begin to think, write, and process your thoughts just like you're writing your own story or book for the world to read. The writing process has 5 steps. They're pre-writing, writing, revising, editing, and publishing. None of these steps are more important than the others, so make sure that you don't skip any and take your time on each of them to make your writing great. The first step is pre-writing. Most people refer to this as brainstorming, simply because all you're trying to do is form ideas. It's best if you write them out on a piece of paper so you remember everything you thought of and can decide if they're good enough to put in or you want to throw them out. After that is the actual writing. Here's where you turn your best ideas into sentences and eventually into paragraphs. Don't worry about them being ready to turn in just yet. As long as you have the basic structure and enough to make a story, you'll be just fine for this step. The next step is revising. This is where you look for ways to make what you've written better. This can be something like taking out or adding a sentence, rewriting entire paragraphs, or simply just changing a single word. A good rule of thumb would be to make at least 2 changes, no matter how much you've written. Your next step would be editing. Once you feel that you're done revising and changing your paper, you should make sure everything is correct. This means checking your spelling, grammar, capitalization, and punctuation, commas, periods, exclamation points. This is a very important step, because if you have these errors, the paper will never be correct. It's easy to get to a friend or a teacher, because most of the time they'll know what to do. The final step is publishing. This is where you turn in your finished product. You should now feel confident and proud of what you wrote and be turning in an A paper. When you put all these steps together, you can write your own story, narrative, or poem. Remember, while doing these steps, you should be creative and have fun. It's a really good way to turn an okay paper into a great paper. Next, we'll be talking about narrative. So what exactly is a narrative? It tells a chain of events told in the form of a story. It will always contain the setting, characters, problem and solution, and events that are in order. There are also 5 parts that make up a great narrative: a title, strong beginning, events that are in order, vivid details, and a good ending. All of these should be included in your narrative, no matter how long or short it happens to be. There are 3 main types of narratives we'll be talking about today: realistic fiction, fantasy, and personal narrative. The first type is realistic fiction. Some characteristics are that they have settings that can be real. That means no fairy tales, dragons, magic, or talking animals. It has to be something believable to everyone who reads it. It also needs characters that act like real people. They should have real emotions, like smiling when they're happy and crying when they're sad. They should also perform real actions, and not using magic or any special powers. The story should also be set in modern times. For example, you should stay in the range of 2000 through today. Nothing that takes place 200 years in the past or the future, no matter how interesting you think it's going to make your story. It should also have a believable and solvable problem. You should focus on the believable part for this. So just make sure it's a problem you can encounter every day, like losing something important to you. And I found student written examples for each narrative so you can have ideas on how to write them. The realistic fiction narrative is by Nathan Hange, and it's called The Surfing Day. Stephen felt the cold, dry sand under his hot, sweaty feet. Feeling the heat, he ran to the cold ocean water. Splash, splash, splash. Stephen had made a gigantic explosion in the water. As he fell down into the water, he tasted the salt water. Feeling sick, he jumped out of the water. Stephen ran for the sand, but stopping, struck seashells. Stephen ran to the palm tree and sat on the sand. Stephen took his bucket and his shovel and scooped up grains of sand and dropped them in his bucket. Stephen was a boy with blonde hair and eyes of the ocean. Stephen was a football player and very talented baseball player. Stephen sat on the sand for hours, clueless and bored. June passes, and all Stephen did was watch surfers go by. When he watched all the surfers, he got interested in surfing. He wanted to learn how. Stephen had an idea. The next day, Stephen went to a surfer bravely and said, "Will you teach me to surf?" The surfer said yes. Stephen got lessons every Saturday morning. Stephen's heart was beating fast. He felt excited and energetic. This is a great example of a realistic fiction narrative because it contains all the elements it needs to. The setting of a boy on a beach is believable to all readers with great detail, and his problem of being bored after playing both the sand and the water has probably happened to most of us. So we know for sure this could happen, although it did not. It also has a believable and solvable problem that is solved in a believable way. The next type of narrative is the fantasy narrative. This is where your imagination comes into play. You can have characters that are animals, objects, or people. And they can all talk or do any action you want them to. You can think of it like a Disney movie, where talking and singing sofas or animals to help you clean your house. Most, but not all, fantasy narratives have a concept of good versus evil. And in most stories, good wins. They also have a real problem solved in an unreal way. For example, you lose your favorite toy and use your superpowers to remember where you put it. It can also take place at any time, past, present, or future. We can talk about cowboys and Native Americans, businessmen or businesswomen, or even aliens. The fantasy narrative example is written by a second grade student, and it's called The Bunny Story. Once there was a bunny. He had a big problem. He didn't think he was special. He wanted to be someone different. He went for a walk. First he met the lion. The lion said, "What are you doing, little rabbit? It's a lot of work watching my kingdom." "Well then, I'll be on my way," said the little rabbit. He thought, "I don't want to be a lion." Then he met a turtle. The turtle said, "What are you doing, little bunny? I have a long way to go and I'm really slow." "Well then, I'll be off." The last animal he saw was a mouse. The mouse said, "I'm on the run from a cat." "Then I'll leave you alone," said the little bunny. The bunny thought, "I'm fine the way I am." The little bunny learned he was fine just the way he is. This is a very well student-written fantasy narrative. It has great imagination seen in the talking animals, as well as the problem that most people could have, but it's solved in an unreal way. The setting it shows is also very good for fantasy narrative because it takes place in a world where there's only animals and it's ruled by animals, just like a Disney movie. The final type of narrative we're talking about today is a personal narrative. This is a story about a memory that you have. That means you are the main character and you are telling the story. You can write about anything that has happened to you at any time in your life. You should use I, me, and my statements so the readers know you're talking about yourself. In your story, you should write about what you did, saw, and your feelings about what happened. You should try and include as much detail as possible, even if it's describing how the trees and plants looked on your walk to school. Also, when describing your emotions, make sure they are real, as we talked about with a realistic narrative. This example is by another second grade student, and it's called The Sled Run. One day, it snowed like crazy, so school was canceled. I had Amy over to play. We decided to go sledding, so we started to slide down the hill. We sledded for a long time. One time we decided to go down together. Amy sat in the front seat and I sat in the back. We started to go down the hill. Then crash! We ran into a bush. Amy and I went flying and I got my feet caught in the bush. Amy looked like a spider caught in its own spider web. I had a lot of fun that day and I'll never forget it. This student's personal narrative is simple and short, but has everything it needs to. It is a very short story about a student's snow day and how he spends it with his friends. Follow the rules using I and we in all the statements so we know it's a story about his memory and what happened to him, as well as describing the events in detail and most importantly in order, and talking about how he felt when something big happened, like when they ran into a bush. Something to remember is that writing a narrative is just like writing a story. It should have a beginning, middle, and end, and lots of details. You should not think about this as a chore and it's another writing assignment. So whether you're writing a story or a narrative, as always, have fun and be creative.